I encourage you to turn to Matthew chapter 28. If you are outside of the Christian faith and perhaps you pay attention to what's going on, many people understand Christmas and Easter, and that's kind of the two things that people understand. They know that Jesus was born, and there's something about a manger, right? And then all of a sudden he's rising from the dead, and there's not a lot of in between there. Now, if you've been in church with us for the past several months, you know we've been working through the whole story of Jesus. And the story of God really doesn't even begin with Jesus. It begins all the way back, and we could spend lots of time working our way up to Jesus' birth. But as Jesus comes into the world, we know that he is born and that he steps into ministry with the baptism, baptized by John the Baptist, and we know that he walks through ministry calling disciples and going around and healing people and teaching, and there's lots to the story prior to where we find ourselves this morning. But when we come to the resurrection of Jesus, especially if we've been reading the entire story, we might wonder why no one expected him to rise from the dead. At least the disciples didn't, right? And as we read the story, we see at least on 3 different occasions Jesus saying to his disciples, I'm going to Jerusalem and I'm going to die and I'm going to rise from the dead. But by the time we come to this story, it seems like they're not even thinking about that. I mean, did they think that maybe Jesus was speaking in non-literal terms? Do you think they were thinking, well, he's talking about resurrection one day out there in the future. He's really not talking about a bodily resurrection 3 days, literal days after he died. Do you think that's what they were thinking? Maybe they were just thinking, well, he's just saying stuff and we don't really know what he's saying. You know, a lot of times Jesus talks and they just don't seem to get it. Maybe they just kind of moved on past that and didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. But again, 3 different occasions Jesus says, I'm going to rise from the dead. So we look at Matthew chapter 28. We are finishing Matthew this morning, and we come to kind of the end of the story as Matthew tells it. And let me set just a little bit of context before we dive into this chapter. Jesus has been killed, and last week we covered his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and we know the events of Holy Week. We know the Lord's Supper on Maundy, Thursday. Good Friday is the day that Jesus was killed, and we celebrate that on Good Friday. But as he comes into the city, that triumphal entry into the city, we know that during Holy Week he goes into the temple, he overturns tables. We know that he is upsetting the religious leaders of the day. And that week they come to the point where they understand that Jesus has to be stopped. And so they bring up false charges and use the Roman system of the day to kill Jesus, to have him crucified. His closest friends, his disciples, all chickened out and fled, right? All except John. But the women stuck with Jesus all the way through. And we watched as the Romans carried out the most inhumane death sentence, perhaps in all of history. And Jesus seems to willingly go along with it. It all seems to be for him part of a plan. But again, his disciples didn't understand. They're devastated. And by the time we get to Matthew chapter 28, we read of the account of 2 women. Look with me in verse 1. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. So Matthew begins with these 2 women here. Now, why are they traveling to the tomb? Now, some say they're going to prepare the body of Jesus. They didn't have time to finish the work on the day that he died. And then the sun set, and it was Sabbath, and in Jewish culture, you certainly didn't go take care of a dead body on the Sabbath, so the women had to wait an entire day. And so as soon as the sun comes up on Sunday morning, they're able to go to the tomb, and so they're going to care for the body. Mark puts it this way, Mark chapter 16, he says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on, the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. Now, others mention that they're going to the tomb to mourn. In Jewish culture, you would often mourn for a period of about a week, and that would include multiple trips to the tomb. And so some say this is what they're doing. They're mourning, they're preparing the body, they're doing all that. But there's no indication that they're expecting Jesus to be risen from the dead. That they're not going to the tomb to see if he had risen. There doesn't even seem to be a possibility of that for them. You know, you would think that at least one person in the group would have said, he said something about rising from the dead. Maybe we should go and check it out. It's the third day, right? He died on Friday, and it's Saturday and Sunday. Maybe we should go and see if he has risen from the dead. But no one, at least in the group of disciples, seems to be thinking in those terms. So everyone is, again, the disciples are hiding out. The women are making their way to the tomb to take care of the body. And Mark fills us in, Mark chapter 16, verse 3. Mark says, they ask each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? So as we read here the going of a tomb, and we understand that the authorities, the religious leaders of the day, had sealed the tomb with a stone. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? That the disciples seem to have no thought of Jesus' resurrection, but the religious leaders are thinking about his resurrection. The religious leaders are wondering, he said that he was going to rise after 3 days. Could he do it? I mean, Jesus had surprised them on a number of occasions, right? Jesus was the kind of guy who went into town and there would be someone who was blind and all of a sudden they can see again. He's someone who would go into town and there's somebody who can't walk and all of a sudden Jesus makes them walk. And the religious leaders knew of Jesus' miracles. They knew of his power, and they knew that he had predicted his resurrection. And so they were serious about this. They said, we're going to make sure he doesn't rise from the dead. We're going to put a stone over the tomb, and not only that, we're going to position 2 guards there to make sure. It seems to be a strange dynamic, doesn't it? But again, Jesus had already accomplished the impossible, and maybe he would rise from the dead, the religious leaders were thinking. Matthew continues to describe the event in verse 2. There was a violent earthquake, Matthew says, for the angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. Now this is a fascinating dynamic here. The disciples are distraught. They're not even in the story at this point. They're hiding out. They're afraid. The women, the ones who had stuck with Jesus, they were making their way to the tomb, possibly to take care of Jesus' body and mourn. The religious leaders, also filled with fear at this point, wonder if Jesus might just do the impossible. So they had the tomb sealed, and they put guards at the tomb. But God is bigger than all the characters in the story. God's bigger than the disciples' fear. He's bigger than the mourning women. He's bigger than the religious leaders attempting to hold on to their power and authority among the people. And so God shakes the earth and he breaks the stone away. Jesus had already risen from the dead. The stone wasn't removed so that he could get out. The stone was removed so that people could see in and understand what had happened. And so Jesus had risen from the dead. Earthquake happened. Stone rolled away. Not only that, but an angel is sitting on the stone. Look at how Matthew describes it in verse 3. His appearance was like lightning. His clothes were white as snow. You might remember a few weeks ago when we studied the Transfiguration, we talked about this white garb, right, or white appearance of Jesus. And we know that that's heavenly sort of dynamics, right? White like lightning. I mean, it's whiter than anything that you could possibly imagine. White as snow. Bleached white. We have another description like that. We know this guy is from heaven, and he freaks out everybody who sees him. Matthew tells us the guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. Now, do you see the humor in Matthew's words here? Who's supposed to be dead at this point? Jesus, right? But these guys, the ones guarding the dead, are like dead men. And the one who's supposed to be dead is not dead at all. Evidently, the women are pretty freaked out too, so the angel speaks to them in verse 5. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, For I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. I know why you're here, the angel tells them. Don't be afraid. He has risen. You're looking for Jesus, and it says what? Who was crucified. I mean, crucified people are supposed to be in tombs. That's just where they are. But look at what he says in verse 6. I got ahead of myself a little bit there. He says, He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. He's supposed to be here, but he's not. He has risen. And those three words are three of the most powerful words in all of history. They really form the basis for the Christian faith, don't they? He has risen. The angel reminds the women that he said that he would. How would this happen? How could this happen? They seem to be astounded by it all. Let's think about this for a moment. This whole dynamic of Jesus rising from the dead. Let's think about death itself. Why do we die? Why is there death? Well, we know from the story of Adam and Eve that we die because of sin, right? And we are all children of Adam and Eve, and because of that, we all sin. Is there anybody here today who has never sinned? No, none of us, right? And because of sin, we have death. But what if someone would come and live a sinless life, not sin? Now that would be impossible, we say. Humans can't do that. But what if God himself would wrap himself in flesh and come into our world and live a sinless life? If anybody could do it, God could do that, right? And that is what the Bible tells us he did. He came into the world and he lived a sinless life. And then would he have to die if he lived a sinless life? Well, not if he didn't sin, right? But what if he chose to die? Then he would have the power, according to Scriptures, to break the curse of sin and death. And that's exactly what he did. God came, lived a perfect sinless life, and then submitted to death, a death that he did not have to die. And because of this, he had the power to break the curse of sin and death. Paul puts it this way in this early Christian hymn recorded for us in Philippians chapter 2. Perhaps you've heard this before, but I think this is important to look at what's going on here in a spiritual realm. Rather, he made himself nothing, speaking of Jesus here, by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. Being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You see what's going on here? Jesus has conquered death. He's humbled himself. He's became obedient to death, and because of that, the power of death, the curse of death, is broken. Now God shakes the earth. The tomb is empty for all to see. It was what the Father, the Son, and the Spirit had been longing for since Adam and Eve. The mission was accomplished. Death is defeated. He has risen, just as he said, the angel said. Come on in, take a look. See for yourself. Look at what the angel tells them to do next. Flip one more slide there. Ian, there we go. The angel says, then go quickly and tell his disciples. He is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you. The angel tells the women, I mean, look at the language here. Go quickly. We see all of these things happening very fast here. They're just trying to take it all in. They can't quite wrap their minds around what they're seeing. They think by now they're supposed to be anointing Jesus' body, and all of this has happened, and they wondered how the stone was going to be rolled away, and it's gone. Now there's an angel there, and the angel is telling them that there's not even a body anymore because Jesus has risen. And he says, I want you to go and tell the others. Who? The men. The disciples, the ones hiding out, the ones freaked out, the ones who had abandoned Jesus. I want you to go and tell them that he's risen. I think it's so cool that God revealed the resurrection first to the women. I mean, the women were the ones who stuck it out, right? They were the ones who didn't abandon him. They were the ones who followed him all the way to the cross and watched him die. They were the ones who were going to the tomb to take care of the body. And it's to the women first that they're able to see that Jesus has risen. Now, I want you to go. The angel tells the women, I want you to go and tell the others. And look what it says here. It says, I want you to tell them to go ahead into Galilee, just as he said. And if you go back to Matthew chapter 26, verse 32, you can see Jesus says to them, after I've risen, go ahead, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And again, that's kind of fascinating that Jesus had told them that, but they had forgotten that. They didn't seem to be thinking about that. But the angel then finishes the statement with, I've delivered my message. That's what I'm supposed to do. I've told you. Now go and do it. Verse 8, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Do you see how many quicklies and suddenlies and hurried and all of that's going on here? I suppose the women are, as they're telling this story to Matthew, they're probably saying, it all happened so fast. We were just going from one thing to the next. And if you're watching this and it's a movie, you would see very fast camera angles, wouldn't you? It would all be moving and things would be happening so fast. That's kind of the mode we get here. And they're described here as afraid yet filled with joy. Look at how Mark describes them. Mark says this about the women. He says they were trembling and bewildered. The women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Do you see how they're described here? I mean, I would bet they're just shaking, right? They don't quite know what it all means. They don't know if anybody's going to even believe them. They're not sure what to do next, but they're following the instructions. They're trembling. They're bewildered. They're afraid. Yet Matthew says they are what? Filled with joy. How can you be trembling and bewildered and afraid and yet filled with joy all at the same time? That's what's going on here. Matthew says, again, they're hurrying away. Again, fast language here. Afraid, yet filled with joy. But the story doesn't end there. Let's keep reading. Look at verse 9. Suddenly, Jesus met them. Again, there's another quick word, right? Suddenly. It all happens so fast. One scholar says that when you see Jesus meeting people, most of the time in Scripture, Jesus is the object of the sentence. The people come to Jesus. The people meet Jesus. But here, Jesus is the subject of the sentence. They're not looking for him. They're not going after Jesus. Jesus finds them. He's the subject of the sentence. He's the one who's doing all of this here. There he was, standing before them. It's one thing, isn't it, to see an empty tomb? It's one thing to hear an angel say he's risen from the dead. And again, they're shaking and they're moving away from the tomb. They're heading back to tell the disciples. And all of a sudden, there he is, standing before them. In all of their fear, in all of their doubts, in all of their trauma, there he is. And how do they respond? Look what it says in verse 9. Greetings, he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Now, I imagine there were tears of joy, tears of confusion, tears of doubt, and what is this? All this is really happening? Are we having an hallucination here? What's going on? And they simply come to him and they grab his feet. They fall at his feet and they clasp on to him. You see, to grab someone's feet is an act of submission. It's an act of worship, and that's what the women do. You might remember back in Luke chapter 7 when the woman is anointing Jesus. It says in Luke 7:38, she stood behind him at his feet, weeping. She began to wet his feet with her tears. She wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them. You see, that's an act of worship, to be at someone's feet. And so that's what the women are doing. They're recognizing Jesus as the Son of God. They're understanding that he is Lord of all creation. They're understanding that he has just died. They saw it. They They saw him nailed to a cross. They saw him breathe his last breath. They saw him placed in a tomb. And now he's alive and standing before them, and all they can do is worship. They clearly believe he is who he said he is. They're surprised. They're caught off guard, but they confess and they respond by worshiping him. Now, we don't really know how long this lasts, but Matthew tells us what happens next in verse 10. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid." Isn't that interesting? He has to say that to them again. Don't be afraid. They keep saying it. Don't be afraid. Well, what are they afraid of? I think possibly their greatest fear is that nobody's going to believe them. Right? They're women in the first century. They have no credibility. Women could not even testify in court in the first century. Their testimony was worthless. Their credibility was very little. And maybe they're worried. Nobody's going to believe us if we say what we have seen. But don't be afraid, Jesus says. Go and tell my brothers, again, to go into Galilee where they will see me. What does Jesus call the disciples? My brothers. They're the ones who abandoned him. They were the ones who turned their backs on him. But all the while, Jesus says, I'm going to appear to them also. I'm going to confirm what you have seen. You're not alone in all of this. They're going to experience what you have experienced. Don't be afraid. Just go and do what I'm telling you to do. Matthew finishes his gospel off then in this chapter. The women meet the resurrected Jesus. Their lives are forever changed. We know that the disciples' lives are forever changed. They'll each end up giving their life for Jesus, being persecuted, many of them, most of them being martyred, all except John again. Verses 16 through 20 here, if you're looking in your text, there's a brief description here of Jesus' ascension into heaven, which really happens much later on. But Matthew comes back and he concludes his writing here with the story about the religious leaders and the guards. And I think that's important for us to look at this morning. Look at verses 11 through 15. Verse 11 says, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. See, Matthew wants us to understand this. Because we might think, well, what happened to the guards? They saw the angel, they were afraid. Well, what did they do next? Well, they go into the city and they tell the religious leaders, hey, you'll never believe what happened. And they're standing there in front of the religious leaders, telling the religious leaders, he rose from the dead. There is no body. In fact, the stone was rolled away and an angel appeared to us. I mean, the religious leaders have to be going, wow. Have you ever thought about that? That the religious leaders had firsthand testimony of what happened. But what would it mean for them if they accepted this? What would it mean for their power? What would it mean for their status? What would it mean for their role as religious leaders if Jesus really did conquer death? If he really was God? If he really was the Messiah? So they're not concerned about truth. Instead, they're concerned about how do we cover this up? How do we make sure word doesn't get out? You see, they had the evidence that Jesus was risen from the dead. If anyone knew that Jesus had risen from the dead, they were the ones that knew. And again, you got to remember the whole history here. They'd seen Jesus do miraculous things. They'd seen Jesus heal. They'd heard his sermons. They'd seen him even raise Lazarus from the dead. Again, I think they were the ones who were expecting him to rise from the dead. And I don't think that they were at all surprised when it happened. It was now a matter of cover-up for them. And look what it says in verse 12. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money. Now, if the soldiers didn't do their job in the first century, what would generally happen to them? Yeah. Death penalty. Death penalty was what would happen if you were a soldier and you went to sleep on guard, you'd be killed. The soldiers know that their life is on the line, so they go to the religious leaders. They don't go to their boss, right? Because they know what's going to happen if they go to their boss. They go to the religious leaders instead because they've seen an angel. And what's been going on here is a spiritual sort of dynamic. And so they don't go to the Roman authorities. They go to the religious authorities. And they figure if anybody knows anything about angels, probably the religious leaders do. So they tell the religious leaders what has happened here, and they're going, something's big about this, right? You know, you got to wonder if they go, if this guy can rise from the dead, he must be God, right? So we're going to go ask the religious leaders, the ones who talk about God, who know about God, and we're going to ask them if perhaps they know anything about this. But when they go to the religious leaders devise a plan and offer them money to not say anything to anyone. Verse 13, telling them, you are to say this, okay? His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. Now, they've got something on these guys, okay? The religious leaders do. If you don't tell them this story, you're going to be executed. And just to make the deal a little sweeter, we're going to give you some money to tell the story that we want you to tell. If this report, it says, gets to the governor, verse 14, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. Okay? This is the line. This is the story. Here's some money. If you go tell people about angels and about earthquakes and about a risen Christ, then we're going to turn you in. You're going to be killed. So the soldiers, verse 15, took the money and did what they were instructed. And this story, Matthew tells us, has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Sleeping guards, stolen body. Now, if you think about it, that story really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it? I mean, what are the disciples doing at this point? They're hiding out behind locked doors, right? They're in no condition to pull off a heist like this. I mean, can you imagine the disciples going and overpowering the guards, breaking the stone away and stealing the body away, and then one day giving their lives for that? That wouldn't make any sense, would it? But that's the story they had, and they were going to stick with it. This ragtag group of disciples, they just weren't up for that sort of thing. But again, it's the only story the religious leaders had. And again, I think we have to understand, how did they approach the resurrection of Jesus? They approached it with fear, with covering it up, rejecting it, saying, no, we cannot let that story get out because we will lose our power if that happens. What a story, right? And then Matthew kind of closes it out with that. What do we do with this? It's Resurrection Sunday. And we might be saying, well, who are we more like in this story? And I think there are places that we could all fit in this story. Maybe for some of us, we approach Resurrection Sunday like the disciples did at this point in time. Kind of afraid, maybe doubting, maybe uncertain. Maybe not sure, I mean, could this really happen? Maybe this morning you find yourself like that. Let me encourage you to seek the risen Christ. Let me encourage you to explore it. Let me encourage you to think about the reality. What if the resurrection of Jesus is true? What does that mean for us? And so for some of us this morning, we need to approach the risen Christ by saying, God, would you please reveal yourself to me this morning? Help me to understand what it means that you are risen from the dead. Maybe for some of us this morning, we would find ourselves more like the religious leaders in the story. We understand the reality of what's going on here, but it would cost us too much to follow Jesus. And so there's fear, there's uncertainty, and so we develop theories. We reject Jesus, we push him back, we say it would cost me too much to follow him. So instead of worshiping and submitting, we simply reject the story. Or maybe for some of us this morning, we find ourselves like the women in the story. Surprised, overwhelmed, having experienced the risen Christ, our lives are forever changed, and we simply fall down and worship. I think that's the most appropriate response to the resurrection of Jesus. This morning, as we come to this Sunday, this Resurrection Sunday, I'd like to take a few minutes to respond to God's Word and give you an opportunity to respond. We have kind of made it a tradition, if you will, in this service to have an open altar, a time when we encourage you to come and maybe kneel and offer a prayer. Maybe this morning there would be some particular need that you have, and you just want to come and offer a prayer for that particular need. You come now and kneel at the altar and pray. Maybe this morning you brought an offering, and offering is an act of worship. And so we have a plate here, and you can simply bring your offering and place it in the plate as an act of worship this morning. If you gave online but would still want to come and place that in the plate, there are green cards here on this small podium. You can just take a green card and just as an act of worship, place it in the plate, just signifying that you've given online or given through your bank account that way. Maybe this morning you would want to pray with someone else who's in the building, and you would see that person. You would just go over and have a prayer with that person. Maybe you'd want to pray or just respond to God by standing right where you are. Maybe this morning you would want to come and make a decision of faith and say, I'd like to be a follower of Jesus, and I don't know how to do that. I'll be standing down front if you'd like to come and talk with me about that. If there's some other need, or if you'd like to come to join the church or to be baptized, you come and talk to me now as we all stand together and sing. Let's stand together.